Today, March 9th, 2026, Iran fired a ballistic missile into Turkish airspace for the second time in 5 days, and the region is watching Ankara's next move. NATO shot it down again. Debris fell across open land in Gaziantep, roughly 120 miles from Incirlik Air Base, where American troops and U.S. nuclear weapons are stationed. 5 days ago, the first Iranian missile entered Turkish airspace on March 4th. NATO destroyed it over the eastern Mediterranean. No casualties, but the Wall Street Journal reported it was headed toward Incirlik. Now it has happened a second time. Same NATO member, same week. And the question every defense analyst in Brussels is asking right now is not whether this was accidental. The question is how many times Iran can fire ballistic missiles into the airspace of a NATO ally before the political cost of calling it anything other than an attack becomes impossible to sustain. Turkey's defense ministry released its statement this morning. All necessary measures will be taken decisively and without hesitation against any threat directed at our country's territory and airspace. That is not the language of a government describing these incidents as accidents. That is the language of a government keeping its options open and fully aware of what those options could trigger. Let's establish the full factual picture first, because the context surrounding these two missile incidents is more consequential than almost any coverage is capturing right now. This all began on February 28th, when the United States and Israel launched Operation Epic Fury, coordinated military strikes against Iran across multiple target sets simultaneously. Iran retaliated immediately and at scale. Strikes hit U.S. military positions in Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, the UAE, and Jordan, all within the first days of the conflict, according to multiple defense sources. On March 1st, 6 U.S. Army Reserve soldiers supporting Operation Epic Fury in Kuwait were killed in an Iranian retaliatory strike. That was the first confirmed American combat deaths of the conflict. A U.S. submarine sank an Iranian warship by torpedo in the eastern Mediterranean, the first such engagement since World War II, according to USNI News tracking the operation. And on March 4th, for the first time in the entire history of the NATO alliance, a ballistic missile fired from Iran entered the airspace of a NATO member state, Turkey's airspace. NATO shot it down. Not once in the Cold War, not during the Gulf Wars, not during any prior Iran confrontation over 40 years. The first time it happened was March 4th, 2026. The second time was this morning, March 9th. Here's the detail that most coverage is moving past too quickly. The March 4th missile was not a stray projectile traveling in a random direction. According to a U.S. military source cited by journalist Michael Weiss, that missile was headed toward Incirlik Air Base, the joint Turkish-American installation 10 kilometers outside Adana. Turkish officials have disputed this claim, but Washington has not officially denied it. And that gap between Ankara's denial and Washington's silence is itself a signal worth noting. Incirlik is not just a military base in the conventional sense. It holds a stockpile of U.S. non-strategic nuclear gravity bombs, B-61 weapons that are part of NATO's formal nuclear sharing arrangement. That is what was in the potential flight path of an Iranian ballistic missile on March 4th, 2026, a NATO nuclear storage site. And this morning, a second missile entered the same airspace from the same direction. The U.S. Embassy in Turkey responded to today's incident by closing its consulate in Adana and ordering non-emergency American personnel to leave southeastern Turkey immediately. The State Department simultaneously issued a broader advisory urging all U.S. citizens to leave the region. When Washington evacuates the area surrounding a NATO nuclear base, that is not a standard precaution. That is a signal about how the United States is currently assessing the probability of further Iranian strikes against that specific geography. And it is a signal worth reading carefully. So where does Erdogan stand right now? Because his position is the most complicated of any leader in this conflict. And it is the layer most live coverage is compressing into a single sentence. On February 28th, when Operation Epic Fury began, Erdogan publicly described the U.S. and Israeli strikes on Iran as a violation of international law. That was his public position within hours of the operation starting. Erdogan expressed personal sorrow at the death of Iranian Supreme Leader Khamenei, who was eliminated in the opening strikes of Operation Epic Fury. He announced that Turkey would not allow its airspace to be used for any offensive operations against Iran, a public line drawn within 24 hours of the conflict starting. Ankara positioned itself as a potential mediator, a bridge between Washington and Tehran, not a participant on either side. That was the playbook Erdogan had used successfully across multiple prior crises. That playbook required one thing that did not happen. It required Iran not to fire ballistic missiles into Turkish airspace. Iran fired them anyway, twice, in 5 days. In my view, this is the sharpest strategic trap any leader in this conflict has walked into. Erdogan condemned the strikes that NATO is conducting. Now NATO is defending him from the country he refused to condemn. He cannot align fully with Washington without abandoning years of positioning with Tehran. He cannot defend Tehran's actions when Tehran is firing missiles into his airspace. There is no clean exit from this position. Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan called his Iranian counterpart Abbas Araghchi after March 4th to formally convey Ankara's protest. Iran's ambassador was summoned to the Turkish Foreign Ministry. That is the procedural language of a government that is registering displeasure through official channels. It is not the language of a government moving toward a military response, at least not yet. After a second missile this morning, analysts at Al Monitor and RU-SI describe Ankara's posture the same way, deliberate and cautious. Turkey is not yet ready to cross into a formal military response, but the calculus is visibly shifting with every new intercept. NATO's hardware has performed exactly as designed. Alliance spokesperson Alison Hart condemned Iran's targeting of Turkey and confirmed that the alliance's deterrence and defense posture remains strong. But U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth said explicitly after March 4th that there was no sense the incident would trigger Article 5. That statement was deliberate. Washington is managing an active war against Iran and is not looking to expand the conflict's legal framework. What this creates is a structural gap between what the NATO treaty says on paper and what the alliance's political leadership is actually willing to formally declare. And what is physically happening to a NATO member's airspace right now, twice in 5 days, is making that gap harder to sustain with every new intercept. And that gap is exactly where the most dangerous ambiguity in this entire situation lives. A gap that is getting harder to maintain with every missile Iran fires north of the Syrian border. If this kind of analysis, the kind that goes past the headline into the mechanics of how these systems actually operate under pressure, is why you come here, drop a comment right now. Tell me in the comments, does Erdogan stay neutral after 2 missiles in 5 days, or does the calculus finally shift this week? And hit the like button right now. It is the most direct signal that tells this platform this story deserves a significantly wider audience. Next, we are going to look at what Article 5 actually requires in legal terms, and why Hegseth's dismissal of it on March 4th was more complicated than it sounded at the podium. We will examine why the gap between NATO's founding treaty and the political reality of 2026 is wider than at any point in the alliance's history. Stay with me. Article 5 has been invoked exactly once in NATO's 76-year history, after September 11th, 2001, when nearly 3,000 people were killed on American soil. Iran fired a ballistic missile into a NATO member's airspace this week, and every senior official in the alliance lined up within hours to say, this does not qualify for collective defense. That response tells you something more important than the missile itself. It reveals precisely where the red lines of the most powerful military alliance in history actually sit in March 2026, and how far those real lines are from where most people assume they are. That gap is the story that most coverage of this week's events has completely missed. Let's start with what Article 5 actually says, because the public understanding of the clause and its legal reality are two different things, and that gap drives everything Ankara is calculating right now. The treaty language reads, an armed attack against one NATO member is considered an attack against all. Then comes the phrase almost nobody quotes in full. Each ally will assist by taking such action as it deems necessary. Not automatic military response, not mandatory deployment. Each member decides for itself what assistance looks like. That phrase, such action as it deems necessary, is not a blank check. It is a discretionary commitment that can mean anything from military force to a political statement to a phone call. This is why Guntram Wolff, senior fellow at the Bruegel Institute in Brussels, told CNBC this week that invoking Article 5 over one intercepted missile would be, in his words, a little bit exaggerated. The underlying logic is real, regardless of the framing. Article 5 requires full consensus among all 32 NATO member states, and that consensus is not available right now, not even remotely. Spain has publicly rejected Washington's characterization of this conflict as legitimate self-defense. France has questioned the legal basis for Operation Epic Fury. Both countries hold full veto power over any Article 5 collective defense declaration, and neither is close to exercising it in Washington's favor. In my view, this is the structural fracture almost no one is discussing publicly. NATO actively defending a member's airspace while refusing to formally describe that act in the terms its own founding treaty requires. Consider what NATO's own systems did on March 4th. Spokesperson Alison Hart confirmed the sequence. Threat identified, trajectory confirmed, defenses alerted, interceptor launched, all within minutes. The hardware performed with precision. The political response that followed moved in the exact opposite direction. And that contrast is the core of the story. Within hours of that intercept, Secretary General Rutte told reporters that nobody inside NATO was talking about Article 5. Nobody was even raising it. Defense Secretary Hegseth at the Pentagon was even more direct. His exact words at the briefing: no sense that it would trigger anything like Article 5. His single word denial: no, at the end of that sentence, delivered at a Pentagon podium. That is not diplomatic hedging. That is a door being firmly and deliberately closed. So why? Why does an Iranian ballistic missile entering a NATO member's airspace, fired from a country currently in active combat with the United States, not meet the threshold Article 5 was designed for? The answer has three distinct layers. Each one reveals something different about how the alliance actually functions under real-world pressure in 2026, as opposed to how it reads in a policy document. The first layer is attribution ambiguity. Iran denied firing a missile toward Turkey. Tehran's Armed Forces General Staff stated the Islamic Republic respects the sovereignty of what it called friendly Turkey. More significantly, anonymous Turkish officials offered an alternative explanation, suggesting the missile may have been aimed at a British Royal Air Force base in Cyprus and went off course over Turkish territory. Cyprus is not a NATO member, if that reading holds, and both Washington and Ankara have reasons to prefer it, then Article 5 was never relevant at all. There was no attack on Turkey. There was a navigation error in a war already generating hundreds of projectiles across the region. The second layer is political arithmetic. France, Spain, and others have called Operation Epic Fury a violation of international law. Invoking Article 5 against Iran would require every one of those governments to formally endorse the U.S.-Israeli campaign as legitimate self-defense. That is not a vote anyone can deliver right now. That political alignment is simply not achievable. Both Washington and Ruta understood this before the missile debris finished falling in Hatay, which is why the Article 5 dismissal came not after careful legal review, but within hours of the intercept, because the political calculation was obvious from the start. The third layer is the one that analysts at both Verisk Maplecroft and the Foundation for Defense of Democracies are flagging this week, and it is arguably the most consequential of the three. Washington does not want Article 5 triggered. Invoking collective defense would formally bring 32 governments into consultation over a war the United States launched without asking the alliance's permission. It would give skeptical members like France and Germany formal standing to demand a ceasefire as a precondition for collective action. The White House fully understands why that outcome serves no one, which means the government most motivated to keep Article 5 permanently off the table is Washington itself, regardless of what Iran fires next. That is an extraordinary position for the founding architect of the NATO alliance to occupy in March 2026, and it tells you everything about where American priorities actually sit right now. Turkey does have a lesser option, Article 4, which allows formal consultation without committing anyone to action. Ankara has invoked it more times than any other NATO member. Historically, Turkey has reached for Article 4 over Syria, over Iraq, and over Russian military provocations along its northern and eastern borders. Article 4 requires no consensus and commits no one to action. It opens a formal diplomatic channel at the ambassadorial level. It is the procedural tool Turkey reaches for when it needs to register a serious threat without crossing into collective defense territory. After March 4th, Turkey did not invoke Article 4 either, according to Daily Sabah, citing NATO officials. No formal consultation was requested. Ankara absorbed the incident through bilateral channels, Fidan's call to Tehran, the Iranian ambassador summoned, and left both treaty articles completely untouched. NATO did respond operationally. Following March 4th, the alliance formally upgraded its ballistic missile defense posture, a concrete step confirmed by O'Donnell and agreed in an ambassador-level meeting in Brussels. That is a concrete military adjustment paired with a deliberate political non-response. Defend the territory with hardware, but refuse to call it what the treaty appears to require, and hope that the gap between those two positions, military action paired with political silence, never grows wide enough to fracture the alliance that has held together since 1949. That equilibrium is under pressure again today, March 9th, after a second missile. Whether it holds through a third or fourth is a question no one inside NATO headquarters can currently answer with confidence. And that uncertainty, visible to every actor watching this conflict from Tehran to Moscow to Beijing, is itself one of the most consequential signals this week has produced. Now let's talk about Erdogan, because his position right now is unlike anything he has navigated in 20 years in power. And understanding why requires going back not to this week, but to a phone call that happened on February 28th, the day Operation Epic Fury began. Erdogan called Tehran within hours of the first American bombs falling on Iranian soil. Not Washington, not Brussels, Tehran. That sequence matters. A NATO head of state, whose alliance was conducting active strikes against Iran, chose to open with condolences to the country being hit, not solidarity with the alliance hitting it. He told Iranian leadership that Turkey stood against what he described as a violation of international law and sovereignty. Those words were not spoken quietly or off the record. They were published by the Turkish presidency's official communications office and broadcast on state television within the hour. That is not diplomatic hedging. That is a public positioning statement designed to be heard by Tehran, by the Arab world, and by Ankara's domestic audience simultaneously. Erdogan has built much of his foreign policy brand on exactly this kind of triangulation. present on all sides, formally committed to none of the combatants. It worked in Ukraine. Turkey sold drones to Kyiv, kept gas flowing from Moscow, hosted peace talks, and maintained full economic relations with both governments throughout the war. It worked in Syria, where Ankara maintained direct military lines with both Washington and Moscow for years without formally choosing either side. The formula requires one thing to function. Both sides have to want Turkey in the room badly enough to tolerate its independence. For most of the last decade, that condition held. Turkey is too large, too strategically positioned, and too economically connected for either Washington or Tehran to push away. But March 4th changed something structural in that equation. And March 9th, 5 days later, changed it a second time. Because the formula requires Iran not to fire ballistic missiles into Turkish territory. And Iran did it anyway, twice, while Erdogan was still publicly defending Tehran's position in the conflict. There is a specific phrase from Turkey's defense ministry statement this morning that deserves far more attention than it has received in today's coverage. The ministry said Turkey will respond decisively and without hesitation to any threat directed at its territory and airspace. Read that carefully. It does not say NATO will respond. It does not say Ankara has consulted its allies. It says Turkey will respond, unilaterally, at its own judgment, on its own timeline. That framing is deliberate. Erdogan does not want to be pulled into an Article 5 framework that puts Washington in control of how Turkey responds to a threat on Turkish soil. He wants to preserve the option of a Turkish response, one calibrated entirely to Ankara's interests, not to the operational requirements of Operation Epic Fury. In my view, that distinction is the most important signal in the entire Turkish posture right now. Erdogan is not moving toward NATO. He is moving toward a third position that does not yet have a name. What does that third position look like in practice? It means Turkey keeps its airspace closed to offensive operations against Iran, as Erdogan publicly promised on February 28th. It means Ankara continues direct diplomatic communication with Tehran, including Fidan's call to Aragchi, even as Iranian missiles are falling on Turkish territory. It means Turkey formally protests through bilateral channels rather than invoking alliance treaty mechanisms that would hand Washington control of the escalation timeline. And it means Erdogan publicly reserves the right to act independently, loudly enough that Tehran hears it as a warning without crossing into the language of actual military commitment. The question every analyst at RUSI and the International Crisis Group is asking this week is how long that position is sustainable. Because there is a specific threshold in Turkish public and parliamentary opinion that has not yet been crossed, but which gets measurably closer with every new intercept over Turkish soil. Turkey has not had a missile fired into its territory by a foreign state power in modern memory. The psychological and political weight of that fact is accumulating with each incident. Turkish opposition parties, both the Republican People's Party and the nationalist MHP, have already begun publicly demanding a stronger response after the second incident this morning. Devlet Bahçeli, the nationalist leader whose political support has been structurally essential to Erdogan's parliamentary majority, called the second missile an act that cannot go unanswered. That is not peripheral pressure. Bahçeli's faction controls votes Erdogan needs. When Bahçeli speaks in that register, Erdogan listens, and the room for continued neutrality shrinks visibly. The domestic political arithmetic is shifting underneath Erdogan's carefully managed external positioning, and that shift is happening faster after the second missile than it did after the first. There is one more layer to the Turkish calculus that almost no English language coverage has addressed directly this week, and it concerns Syria. Turkey currently has active military forces operating in northern Syria. Iran has significant allied militia presence throughout Syrian territory, including areas near Turkish operational zones. Those two force structures have coexisted under a fragile set of de-escalation agreements negotiated through the Astana process, agreements that depended on a baseline of Turkish-Iranian diplomatic functionality. That baseline is now under direct stress. When Iran fires into Turkish airspace twice in 5 days, the informal architecture that kept those forces from friction in Syria begins to look considerably less stable. Erdogan is managing not just a diplomatic crisis and a domestic political pressure wave. He is managing a potential operational risk across an active military theater simultaneously. In my view, the combination of those three pressures, the domestic political arithmetic, the NATO alliance fracture, and the Syrian operational exposure, is what makes Turkey's position the most structurally complex of any actor in this conflict right now. Not the most militarily powerful, not the most economically exposed, but the most difficult to navigate without triggering consequences on at least one of those three fronts, regardless of which direction Ankara moves. Iran apparently calculated that Turkey's neutrality was durable enough to absorb 2 missile incidents without a meaningful military response. That calculation may yet prove correct. But it is a calculation that requires Iran to be right about Erdogan's domestic constraints, his alliance dependencies, and his tolerance for public humiliation, simultaneously and indefinitely. That is a significant amount of weight to place on a single strategic assumption. And the margin for error is narrowing with every new debris field in Gaziantep. Next, we are going to look at what this conflict is doing to energy markets in real time, and why the economic signal coming out of the Strait of Hormuz right now is more consequential than any missile trajectory. Stay with me. Here's the detail that almost nobody is discussing today, and it changes the entire logic of what Iran is doing with these missiles into Turkey. Iran is not trying to pull Turkey into this war. Iran is trying to keep Turkey out of it, on Iranian terms, not on Ankara's terms. That sounds counterintuitive when you are looking at missile debris in Gaziantep, but it becomes clear the moment you look at what Iran has not done. Iran has not struck Turkish military assets. It has not targeted Turkish radar installations, or the air defense batteries that shot its missiles down. It has not publicly accused Turkey of providing intelligence to NATO forces. It has not threatened Ankara directly in any official statement since February 28th. What Iran has done is fire missiles that entered Turkish airspace in trajectories that its own military understands are being tracked and intercepted by NATO systems. In my view, that pattern is not carelessness. It is a deliberate message, one delivered through trajectory and timing rather than through official words. The message reads approximately like this: "We know where your bases are, we know what flies over your territory, and we are choosing not to make you a target, for now." That conditional, for now, is the operational lever Iran is holding over Erdogan's entire position in this conflict right now. Because if Turkey ever formally joins the operational framework of this war, even passively, that conditional disappears. Immediately. Let's look at what that means for the one asset in this entire region that nobody wants to see drawn in, the Incirlik Air Base. Incirlik sits 10 kilometers outside Adana in southern Turkey. It hosts roughly 1,500 U.S. military personnel and serves as a forward logistics hub for American air operations across the Middle East. But what makes Incirlik categorically different from every other American installation in the region is what sits inside its storage vaults. According to the Federation of American Scientists and multiple NATO policy documents, Incirlik holds approximately 50 B-61 nuclear gravity bombs, part of NATO's formal nuclear sharing arrangement. These are not strategic warheads sitting in hardened silos. They are tactical weapons designed to be loaded onto aircraft and delivered to a target, requiring a permissive action link code held jointly by U.S. and NATO personnel. The U.S. Embassy in Turkey ordered non-emergency personnel to evacuate southeastern Turkey on March 9th. The State Department issued a broader travel advisory to all American citizens in the region. That evacuation order covers the geography surrounding Incirlik, and Washington does not order evacuations around nuclear storage sites because the situation feels manageable. Every major actor watching this conflict, Tehran, Moscow, Beijing, understands exactly what is stored at Incirlik and what its operational status means for the conflict's escalation ceiling. The moment any missile, regardless of intent, lands close enough to Incirlik to raise questions about the security of those weapons, the entire escalation framework of this war changes instantaneously. That is not a theoretical scenario. The March 4th missile, according to a U.S. military source cited by journalist Michael Weiss, was tracking toward Incirlik before NATO intercepted it. Turkey officially disputed that reading. Washington did not confirm it, but notably did not deny it either. That silence has been sitting in every NATO meeting since March 4th. Now, let's look at where this situation goes from here, because the trajectory over the next 2 to 3 weeks is more open than at any point since February 28th. There are 3 distinct paths the Turkish situation can take from this morning, and each produces a structurally different outcome for the entire region. The first path is continued absorption. Ankara keeps intercepting, keeps protesting through bilateral channels, and Iran eventually stops probing Turkish airspace. This is clearly the path Erdogan prefers. It preserves the mediator role, protects economic relationships on both sides, and avoids the domestic political cost of open conflict. The precondition is that Iran makes a different calculation, that the cost of continuing to probe Turkish airspace exceeds the value of the signal it is sending to Washington and Brussels. After 2 incidents in 5 days with no meaningful military consequence for Tehran, there is limited evidence that Iran has reached that calculation yet. The second path is a Turkish unilateral response, not through NATO mechanisms, but through Ankara's own military framework, targeted at the launch infrastructure responsible for the airspace violations. Turkey's armed forces are not a minor actor. They operate one of the largest standing armies in NATO, with significant strike capacity and deep operational experience from Syria and Iraq. A targeted Turkish strike against Iranian launch positions would not require NATO authorization and would not trigger Article 5 consultations, but it would permanently alter every diplomatic channel between Ankara and Tehran. In my view, this is the path Bahçeli's faction is pushing toward, and the path Erdogan's defense ministry statement was designed to keep open without formally committing to. The third path involves back-channel negotiation, a bilateral understanding in which Turkey signals clearly to Tehran what specific actions cross a military response threshold, and Iran adjusts accordingly. Turkey and Iran have a long history of exactly this kind of management. The Astana process, the Syria de-escalation agreements, and the grain corridor negotiations all ran on bilateral communication well below the level of public statements. The question is whether that channel is still functional after 2 missile incidents, and whether Iran's current posture under direct military pressure leaves room for the kind of calibration back channels require. What makes all 3 paths unstable is a factor none of them fully controls: the pace of the broader conflict between the United States, Israel, and Iran. If Operation Epic Fury escalates further in the coming weeks, Iranian missile activity across the region increases, and the probability of additional Turkish airspace incidents rises with it. If the conflict moves toward a ceasefire or negotiated pause, the pressure on Erdogan eases, and his mediator role potentially becomes more valuable, not less. The economic dimension of Turkey's exposure is not abstract. Turkey imports approximately 90% of its oil and natural gas, according to the International Energy Agency. A significant portion of that energy now transits routes inside an active conflict zone. Turkish inflation was officially running above 30% annually entering March 2026, with independent economists estimating the real figure closer to 54%. Every point Brent crude rises above the pre-conflict baseline costs the Turkish economy in ways that translate directly into domestic political pressure. Pressure Erdogan cannot indefinitely absorb. The economic and security pressures are both pointing in the same direction for Ankara, toward de-escalation, toward mediation, and away from any form of military involvement. But both depend on Iran cooperating with a logic that serves Turkish interests, and Iran has demonstrated twice in 5 days that it is operating on a different logic entirely. In my view, the most consequential question here is not whether Turkey invokes Article 5 or launches a unilateral strike. Both are visible, nameable outcomes with clear precedents. The more consequential question is what happens to the informal architecture, the back channels, the Astana framework, the bilateral understandings, that has kept this region from full fragmentation across a decade of overlapping crises. That architecture was built when Turkey and Iran shared enough common interests to sustain communication through disagreement, managing Kurdish political power, limiting American footprint, preserving economic ties. 2 missiles in NATO airspace in 5 days does not destroy that architecture overnight, but it stresses every structural joint simultaneously. And that loading is increasing, not decreasing. And what we are watching in Turkey this week is not simply a missile defense story. It is the stress test of a regional order that was always more fragile than it appeared from the outside. NATO's hardware intercepted 2 missiles cleanly. The political and diplomatic structures underneath that hardware are being tested in ways that no interceptor can resolve. Drop a comment right now. Does Erdogan hold his neutral position through this, or does a 3rd missile finally force his hand? If you followed this story from the beginning, subscribe, because what happens in Ankara over the next 2 weeks will shape this conflict in ways that go well beyond Turkey's borders.